This time in the year of our Lord 2023. So glad you could be with us today. As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And I, as my role as host of this program, will endeavor to answer your question to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, the scripture, the tradition, the fathers, the medievals, the popes, the councils, the saints, the doctors, the catechisms, and just about anything I can find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. We come to you every week on Wednesday from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And sometimes at the top of the program, I have some questions that have been mailed in or topics to cover that I do today. So we're going to tackle those in the next minute or so. And I just want to give you the rules of the game here, which is not many. Put the word question in capital letters in front of your question if you do have a question, so that I can know it's a question when I scroll down the chat board. And the only other thing would be to let other people come in and limit your questions to perhaps 2 or 3, like if you have a follow-up question, for example. And I will definitely accommodate that, but we also want to get as many people in as possible, and I want to answer as many questions as possible. So keep that in mind. Also, the only other rules we have are to be a gentleman or a lady and treat others with respect and kindness. And I don't mind if you chat on the chat board. That's what the chat board is for. But please respect everybody's opinion, and you know how to conduct yourselves. I don't have to teach you. So with that, let me get to some of the questions that were mailed in, and then we'll get right to your questions on the chat board. All right. So first question we have is from Jason. And Jason says, I can no longer watch your program live because of my work schedule, so I want to posit a question for you here. I believe the geocentric model to be true, but can you answer the phrase sunrise, sunset in the geocentric model? I have heard that these descriptions prove that the sun's motion is being described from man's point of view, since secular and or heliocentric defenders use the same language. In other words, if the Bible is using sunrise, sunset, literally going up from the horizon to zenith to sunset, it has to be a point of view expression in either model, even in the flat earth model. If you have time, please answer on your program. I always watch it later on YouTube. Well, that is good. I'm glad YouTube still allows me on. So, in the geocentric model, we're going to use the same language, sunrise and sunset, and we will readily admit that that is what you call phenomenological language, or as you see it language. We make no bones about it that many times Scripture speaks that way, from a man's point of view. Okay. So since that is the case, whether you're heliocentric or geocentric in your cosmology, you're going to use the same language, and you will admit that you're speaking from the point of view of the man looking at the sun. Okay. So that's not a point of contention at all. Although some people distort that, as you have said here, that some people have told you that this proves that it's from man's. Well, of course it does. So that's not an issue. What we really need to understand is when Scripture goes behind the scenes and gives us another viewpoint to look at, okay, or tries to explain what is happening behind the phenomenological language, okay, then we're going to have a difference, okay? For example, all the passages that say, and there's about, I don't know, 6 of them or so, all the passages, especially in the Psalms, that say the earth doesn't move, okay, that is what you would more or less call a scientific position, a position that goes behind the phenomenological viewpoint, where you see the sun going up and down the horizon, to a point where you are now in the realm of asking, okay, I know that both the sun and the earth can't be moving. Okay, I know, in other words, I know that both the sun can't be going up and down and the earth rotating relative to one another. Only one movement's going to be allowed. Okay, if that weren't the case, then we we'd have a rotation of the earth and the movement of the sun in 24 hours. And so that's going to lessen the day to 12 hours. Okay. You can't have that. So, in explaining then how it happens that we see the sun rising above the horizon and later setting into the horizon at sunset, how do we explain that? And, well, either one has to be true. Either the sun has to be moving or the earth has to be rotating. That will be the scientific position. Of those two, which one does Scripture pick when it explains the issue? Well, it picks the earth not moving, which then automatically, scientifically, logically means that the sun has to be moving. Okay, because we just said that they both can't be moving. Okay, so that's how you would deal with those passages. So if you're in a conversation with somebody, you'd say, yeah, of course, the Bible does use that kind of language. Sun rises, sun sets. Okay, so but in both the heliocentric or geocentric cosmology, we know that that's just from what we see. Okay, we have to go behind the scenes and explain it, and we do that all the time in life, don't we? We see something that looks, especially when we're dealing with movement, we see something that looks like it's moving. Well, is it moving? If you're on a train and in the station and you're sitting still and all of a sudden it looks like you're moving, but you're not moving. It's the train next to you that's moving. Okay. So relatively speaking, it looks like you're moving, but you're not really. The way you would go out and check that scientifically is you'd go outside the train and see if your train was moving. Okay. And that's exactly what the Bible does too. In instances where it needs to explain what's going on, it will do so. We also find this, for example, in the book of Joshua. Joshua is fighting 5 foreign armies. He's on top of the mountain, and there's a lot of foreigners to slay, and he's running out of time. He knows he's going to need at least a day to clear the field, and he asks God to keep the sun in the sky for a whole day extra, and God answers his prayer, keeps the sun in the sky for a whole day. This is in Joshua chapter 10, in case you want to read it. So here the scripture is giving us a behind the scenes look. Okay, so what's really happening? Is the sun moving and then stopped, or is the earth rotating and then it stopped? Well, the way that scripture is written here, it's saying that the sun is stopped, which means the sun had to be moving across the sky. Okay. And then it says, in order to back this scientific viewpoint up, it adds another celestial body, the moon. And it says, the moon also stopped over the valley of Ajalon. And that would be about 30 degrees above the Mediterranean Sea. And it stopped right there for a whole day. Okay. So the sun is stopped at the noon position. So Joshua could have the most intense light, because that's what the noon position will give, the most intense light for the sun during that day. And the reason why, in a militaristic explanation, would be that since he's on the top of the mountain and the foreign armies are coming up to try to capture him and fight the war, moving up the mountain, well, the fact that the sun is beating down on them and you have the glare of the sun, it's going to be awful hard for them to win the battle against Joshua's army, because Joshua's army is looking down and the sun is behind them. So they're not getting the glare. The only glare they might get is from the shields of the foreign armies, but that will be negligible. So that's why he's asking for God to keep the sun in the sky for a whole day. If that's the case, he has what they call the superior advantage in a militaristic formation. So he's going to take advantage of it. And so, but how do we know that it's not the Earth that's stopping its rotation? Okay, if you assume that the Earth was rotating, how do we know that? And as a matter of fact, this is the argument that Galileo gave to St. Robert Bellarmine. And Bellarmine said, no, you can't say that. You don't know that. First of all, the prima facie language of the text is saying that the sun stopped from moving. It never, and not only in Joshua, but in the rest of the Bible, it never says the earth stopped moving. Because if it had stopped moving, that means it was moving. And if it was moving, then Scripture couldn't say that it has never moved. Okay. So, but how do we prove this scientifically? Well, this is where the moon comes in. Okay. Since the moon is stopped and the moon is also going around the earth every day, I don't know if you notice this or not, but probably good that you check it out. You'll see the sun and the moon going across the earth every day, and they don't go the same speed. Okay. And sometimes I get this mixed up, whether the sun's moving faster or the moon's moving faster. I think it's the sun moving faster. Okay. And so day after day, the moon will lag behind the sun the more days you look at it. Okay. Which means what? It means that the moon is going at different speed. Okay. Now, all of them, all the celestial bodies, the sun, moon, stars, are all going around the earth once per day. But then they have what we call proper motion. That is motion that's independent to the celestial body that you're looking at. Okay. The sun, for example, has an independent movement from the stars because the sun has what we call a retrograde movement. That is, it keeps pace with the stars as the whole universe goes around, but by about 1 degree per day, it's slower than the stars are. And that's why we have two different times. We have what we call sidereal time for the day, and that day, sidereal day, is 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4.09 seconds. Okay. The sun's day, that is how long it takes the sun to go around from point to point, would be 24 hours. So there you have a difference of almost 4 minutes between the stars and the sun. Okay. And that's what makes our year, because as the sun goes back 1 degree per day, about, it takes 365 days for it to get back to the original point it started at, the constellation Aries. That's why the zodiac begins with Aries. And then the moon also has an independent movement of the sun and the stars. It goes slower than both. Okay. Even though everything's going around once per day, the moon has its own independent movement, and that takes about 29 days. Between 28 and 29 days for the moon to go all the way around in its independent movement. All right, so what does all this mean? Why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this because if the moon has an independent movement from the sun, and the explanation for Joshua from Galileo is that, well, it's just God stopped the earth from rotating. Well, if that was the case, then the moon would still move. You see, because if you stop the earth from rotating, yes, the sun would appear to be in the same position in the sky for the next 24 hours, but not the moon. The moon would keep on going because it has an independent movement from the sun and an independent movement from the rotation of the earth, if you want to look at it that way. Okay. And in about 5 hours from where the moon was said to stop, it would plunge into the Mediterranean Sea just in about 5 hours. Okay. And you wouldn't see it anymore. So what does that mean? Well, that means then the text is wrong. Okay. Because the text says that both the sun and the moon stopped in the sky for a whole day, an extra 24-hour day. But that would not be true if the earth was stopped from rotating. It's only going to be true if both the sun and the moon were stopped supernaturally by God for a whole day. Okay. So here's another scientific way that we determine that no, it's not the rotation of the earth, because that would be an earth that's moving. It is God stopping the sun and the moon because they were already moving. You see, that's how we would explain it. So, okay, there was another question here, and I hope it's not a long one. What did I do with it? It was here. Here. All right, let me just check this out. I didn't read it before, so. Okay, this goes back to the Latin Mass. I know that's a big issue these days, but I wish it wasn't. I wish we could just get over things like this and move on. Anyway, it says, while I agree with your sentiments per se about having Mass celebrated in the vernacular, you seem to assume that those who prefer the TLM do so due to some kind of mystique of the Latin language. It's much more than that. If you haven't seen, I would recommend the docuseries The Mass of the Ages. It's fair and balanced, blah, blah, blah. It also shows the great amount that was chopped from the old missal when they came up with this Novus Ordo. Okay. With all this said, and while balancing what you say about the vernacular, including in light of the gospel being manifest in the vernacular of Pentecost, what do you make of exorcists like Father Rippiger who still make a case for the more beneficial use of Latin than the old rite, including exorcisms? All right, so I didn't look at these links, but I do have a few comments. First of all, you may not have your love for the Latin Mass based on a mystique of the Latin, but I've heard this from many people that somehow the Latin is a superior heavenly language, like somebody speaking in tongues or something. And that's why they go to the Latin Mass, because they get this sort of mysterious mystique in the Latin Mass in not knowing what's being said in the vernacular. It sort of makes the language on an upper level because it's not your own language. Okay. I would say that is, there are people that do believe that there's a mystique, a mystery to the Latin language. But that's because they've been, I think, influenced to think that way about it. Okay. The Latin language is just another language. That's all it is. And, like I said last time, the Mass was in Greek for the first 3 centuries. And then Latin took over because that was the popular language of the day, and the church used it. You see the principle that the church is using? It's, okay, what's the popular language of the day? Latin. All right, so let's use Latin. We're not going to use Greek because although that used to be the popular language, not anymore. Okay, the Romans conquered the Greeks. And when that happens, when one country takes over another country, usually the language of the conquering country follows in. Okay, so that was the case then. So there was no mystique about it. This was just the way that the people spoke at the time. And the church kept it because, she used it in her documents, and that helps. I will admit that much, that when you write a document in Latin and you've crossed all your T's and dotted all your I's to make sure it's correct in one language, well, that may not be true in another language. You may have to make some adjustments in another language to make it coordinate with what the Latin had said. Okay. Not all the time, but there may be instances where you have to do that. Okay. And so it will be much better to have it in Latin than have to make any adjustments, at least for the, doctrinal, dogmatic level of using a language. Okay. I have no problem with that. And, they still do that today. The Catechism, for example, the 1994 Catechism, the 1997 Catechism of the Catholic Church was originally written in Latin and then translated into all the other languages. Okay. So the Latin was used because that was the traditional way to make it as precise as possible with as much as the Latin afforded them. Okay. So now you do run into problems, however, with Greek as opposed to Latin, because Latin didn't have any articles. It was a decline language, just like Greek was, where you have, in English, we don't have, like the nominative case, we have that. The genitive will have that, but it's not like you have to change the spelling of the words in order to know whether it's nominative or genitive or dative or whatever it is. And that's what a decline language will force you to do. And Greek's the same way. So that presents a little problem because we don't use decline languages in many of the Western languages that we have today, whether it's German, French, Italian, Spanish, whatever. Nobody uses decline languages anymore. So that becomes a little problem. Not earth-shattering problem, but it's just not as easy to go from one language to the other when you're dealing with a decline language in the first place. And so then you say that there was a lot of stuff chopped from the old missal. Well, I'm not as alarmed about that as some other people might be, okay? Because this is what happens to the Mass, is that, Pope so-and-so wanted to add this to the Mass. Okay, so he adds that. The 300 years later, Pope so-and-so wanted to add this to the Mass, so he adds that. And by the time you're done, you have this Mass that was rather simple when it began, and now it's filled with all kinds of interesting little things. And I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm just saying that now you have a Mass that could be 2 hours long instead of 1 hour long. Okay. And the main thing about the Mass is the confection of the Eucharist. As long as that language is the same, then we're going to confect the Eucharist no matter what Mass it is. And it doesn't really matter how many prayers you tack onto it. It's not going to make the Mass any holier. Okay. God is satisfied with the main objective of the Mass to confect the Eucharist. That's what we receive. That's what we go there for. And of course, we're going to make sure that we have a holy atmosphere when we confect the Eucharist. So we say prayers, we confess our sins. How many times do we confess our sins during the Mass? Probably about 10 times, if you've ever noticed. Okay, so all that liturgy wants to make sure that we're ready to receive the Eucharist, because we ask forgiveness of our sins. Everything basically we say is forgive us of our sins. First thing we say in the Mass, we ask God to forgive us of our sins. Okay, why? Because we have to be pure when we go and receive the Eucharist. like a pure virgin meeting her husband, let's say. Okay. That's the way you do it. You confess your sins at the Mass. So a lot of those prayers are geared toward confession of sin. Now, of course, if you have mortal sin, it's not going to do you any good. You have to go to the confessional before you even go to Mass to have their mortal sins forgiven. But, the tendency is that let's tack on another prayer. Oh, it might be short, but, you tack it on. And so you've added to the Mass. And then somebody else says, well, let's add this. And before you know, it gets pretty big. Okay. So that happens over the centuries without even knowing it. It happens. And so we have a Mass that's rather long, but that's not going to make it any better because it's longer and has more prayers to it. Okay. As long as you have the essential prayers that all are centered around recognizing that you're a dirty, rotten sinner and you're receiving God himself in the Eucharist, that's basically all you need. Okay. And that's what the Novus Ordo does. So in cutting a couple of those prayers, or however many were cut out, you make the Mass simpler. Okay. It's going to have the same effect. It's just going to be a little simpler and take up less time. Okay. And, so I don't see anything wrong with the Novus Ordo because it took some of the prayers out. Okay. It's just not going to pass muster, at least with me. Then you say how about the Father Rippinger, and I know Father Rippinger, and he's a good exorcist, saying that the exorcism in Latin is more beneficial. Well, I don't know how you would come to that conclusion, because you'd have to get the same situation wherein the same person is possessed in the same way at the same time and do the Latin and do the Novus Ordo and see which one works. But I don't think that's the way Father Rippinger works. Okay. And I'm sure he's not saying that using the Novus Ordo language or the English language, that he's never had a successful exorcism. Okay. Now, if he could prove that every time he did an exorcism using English, it was never successful, he might have something. And that every time he did it in Latin, it was successful. Okay. I think he'd have some talking points. But unless that's true, and I don't think it's true, I don't think Father Rippinger would have an argument that says, well, the Latin is not only preferable, but it's the only language we can use in an exorcism because we know it's going to be successful. He just wouldn't be able to prove that unless he did the scenario I just gave. Okay. So, I mean, if you do it for nostalgic reasons, like the original exorcisms were put in Latin, so that's probably the way we should do it. I could see that, because it's the same argument I gave for why we still put dogmatic teachings, doctrinal teachings, catechetical teachings into Latin first, because that's the intellectual language of the church that she has used, where the words never change meaning, and that's good, because if somebody's writing in the 5th century and somebody's writing in the 15th century, you want to make sure you have the same vocabulary. Okay. And Latin affords that to us. So we can compare the meaning of one word over 1,000 years because that meaning has not changed. Okay. Or not altered or nuanced in any way. So that does help. Okay. And so, again, I'm all for that. So if the exorcist wants to use Latin because of that, because there's no semantical range in in Latin language that he has to worry about. He knows that this word means this, and he uses it in his exorcism. Okay, fine, that's great. Okay, but when you get to the Mass, and you know that there aren't any issues like that, that the ones who are going to put the Mass in the vernacular are going to make sure that they maintain the same meanings for those words that were in the original Latin, and the Latin made sure that they were the same meanings that were in the original Greek for the first 3 centuries. Okay. You know, there's really no contention here. If you've done your homework, then there's nothing to worry about, that you're going to get a change in meaning of the words from Latin to English or Latin to French or whatever. You know, they're going to be the same, like the words that confect the Eucharist. Okay, you can translate them into any language, and you're not going to have some semantical variation between those different languages. They're all they're all going to say the same thing. Okay, this is the body of Christ. I mean, how many different ways could you say that? Okay, each language has a way to say that everybody understands. So there's nothing wrong with the language per se. The only gripe you have here is that some prayers were taken out. Well, like I said, you know, rightly so. You know, you just putting more and more prayers on it, it's not going to make it any better. It's just going to make it longer. Okay, and I don't mean to be crass here at all, like saying, well, the prayer doesn't have any value. Sure, the prayer has value, but does it belong in the Mass? Okay. Are we going to make the Mass too long? I mean, we got to be practical about this. Okay. I mean, you could put as many prayers as you want into the Mass and make it 3 hours long. Is that what you want? Somebody could come by and say, hey, you know what? You don't say enough prayers here for this holy Mass, for this confection of the Eucharist. This looks like, you know, some pagan put it together. So let's add some more prayers. Okay. Yeah. And you'll be there all day praying. Okay. Is that really what God wants? I don't think so. Okay. I don't think so. All right. So let me. Oh, I also wanted to thank many of you for your generous donations. I just made a sort of a closing remark last time I was on and said that we needed help. And I didn't make a big deal about it. I remember saying, I don't like to beg, but I'm begging, you know, to help us. And a lot of you took it to heart and just flooded me with help. So I really want to give my thanks to you. And I have some of them here. And I'm not going to mention your full name, but I am going to mention your name just to let you know that I received it, and I thank you so much for your generosity. And you know, I just hope that makes you feel appreciated, because I certainly appreciate your help. It's not easy doing this, believe me. And let me see. So, all right. So I have some of them here. I hope I have all of them. I don't know if I do or not. But anyway, so I want to thank Robert W. for his donation. Robert and Marilyn W. And I want to thank John J. period. So I'm just going to give the first name and the first letter of the last name. And I want to thank John T. And thank Christopher J. And Luke C. and Joseph E., Patrick K., Edward R., and Steve S. Now, like I said, I hope I have all of them here, but I just want to thank you guys again for, your heartfelt compassion. That's what I call it, heartfelt compassion. So I know it's not easy for you either. So, at any rate, let me now go to the question board here. And see what's on your mind. All right. So, hi, Dr. Sungenis. Is there a geocentric answer to why the Pacific and Atlantic are at different levels by Panama? You mean by Panama? Do you mean like at the Panama Canal or close to Panama? So, well, I first have to check that out before I would attempt an answer on that, because I've never heard that before, that the Pacific and the Atlantic are at different levels. Because scientifically speaking, they should not be at different levels. Okay. Now, I know why they're at different levels at the Panama Canal, because that's the way canals work. It takes a ship that's high up and then brings it down, and by putting it through chambers with water and all that stuff. But that's not what you're talking about, I'm sure. You're saying that there's a different level to the Atlantic as opposed to the Pacific. Now, the Pacific Ocean is deeper than the Atlantic. I know that much. But that would not affect the what you would call the what is that? It's normal terminology they use, sea level. Okay, so like if a building on the eastern side of Panama is 1,000 feet above sea level, the top of the building, that is, and that same building were transported to the western side where the Pacific Ocean is, it's still going to be 1,000 feet above sea level. Okay. That's what I know of science. And I can't think of a reason why one ocean would be higher, that's from sea level, measuring from sea level, than another. Okay. It just doesn't make sense to me. So I'm going to have to investigate that before I can give you a more definitive answer. But that's my preliminary answer. Because I believe you're saying that the level of the ocean is different for Atlantic than the Pacific. Okay, so I'm writing this down. This will be an intriguing little study. All right, next question is, does the existence of GPS, Global Positioning System, prove Einstein's general relativity? Hence also that time is not absolute, or is it just a false evolutionist claim? All right, so in order to see, this makes it tricky because Einstein has two theories, all right, special relativity and general relativity. And the way they work it is, if special relativity can't answer a problem, then they'll use general relativity. If general relativity can't answer the problem, then either they, don't answer the problem, or they try to go back to special relativity. Okay. It's just the nature of the beast, how this all worked out. Okay. So what we can say for sure is that the GPS does not prove special relativity. And that's usually the theory that they try to say the GPS proves. Okay. And I've gone through this before on this program, but since you asked the question, I haven't covered it in a while. Let me do that because it's very important for people to understand this. Okay, so we all know, I think, how the global positioning satellites work. You basically you have like 24 satellites up there, each covering a different time zone. I think that's the way it works. And then it takes 3 satellites in the sky and 1 ground station transmitter to work with those 3 GPS satellites in order for you to look in your car and watch that arrow go up the street to show you where you are. Okay. So it takes 4 of them, basically 1 ground station and at least 3 GPS satellites, so they can triangulate your position. Now, I'm not going to go into what triangulation is. It's just a way you can use the Pythagorean theorem to figure out where something is if you have at least 3 known points, and the 4th one will certainly help to secure it. So now the way these GPS satellites communicate with each other is they send electromagnetic beams from one satellite to the other. And they will all 3 of them will send an electromagnetic beam to the ground station. And calculations will be made by the computer within a split second so that you can know where you are when you're driving your car. Okay? Or you know where you have to go when you drive your car. Okay? So if that's the case, if they're exchanging electromagnetic beams, then those electromagnetic beams better be pretty precise. Because when you're dealing with these kinds of distances, and that is between the satellites and between the satellites and Earth, the time has to be absolutely precise. Otherwise, you may be off 15 miles from where you really are or where you want to go. So the GPS really wouldn't work, wouldn't be practical. So those light beams have to be precise. Now we know that on Earth, at least in our environs, the speed of light is limited to 186,000 miles per second. And you can put that in kilometers. It's about 300,000 meters per second. Kilometers per second. But it's actually 299,792, blah, 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 and a few other digits. So they have it down pretty precise. Okay. So what happens, however, if the electromagnetic beam that you're sending from one GPS in the West, say it's over California, to another GPS over New York, and then you send that same signal from New York to California, the California GPS that's over California, and you get a different time, you're going to have problems. Okay. Because as I said, that calculation of the speed is going to determine where the computer is going to tell you are at the ground station. Okay. But what actually happens in the GPS is that when they send a signal from the California GPS to the New York GPS, it's slower by about 50 nanoseconds. 50 nanoseconds. Now, that might not seem a lot to you, but to GPS technicians, it's like, you might as well say it's an hour late because that's a lot, 50 nanoseconds. And when you send that same beam from the New York GPS to the California GPS, it's going to be faster by 50 nanoseconds. Okay, so what's going on? Well, the first thing it tells us, and by the way, I've got this all from a GPS engineer, okay, who knows the GPS inside and out. He died a couple of years ago, but his papers are still on the internet. And what was his name? Ron Hatch. Ron Hatch, Hatch. You can look that up on the internet and you'll see all his work on this. He used to work for a company called Navcom in California. And Navcom contracted with John Deere Tractor to allow John Deere tractors to move without being manned. In other words, they were going to be controlled by the GPS satellites. And in order for a tractor to do its job, it needs to go in a straight line. Now, it's a little hard to make straight lines on a curved earth, but you can do it to a certain extent and you won't have any problem. But the GPS needs to tell that tractor where to go to keep going in a straight line. Otherwise, the tractor is going to go off to the left or the right, and it's going to ruin the whole field. Can't plant crops if your lines aren't straight. And so in order to get the GPS to make the tractor go into a straight line, Mr. Hatch had to go into the GPS computer and find out what the computer, how the computer worked, and allowed the tractor to go in a straight line. And so he had to go into all the lines that they write in the computer language, computer program, and he found out that the GPS engineers knew that the electromagnetic beams that were going east to west were going 50 nanoseconds faster every day, all day, than electromagnetic beams going from west to east. Okay, so what did that tell them? Well, that told them this little secret that they don't want anybody to know, and that is that Einstein's special theory of relativity doesn't work, because that theory is based on the idea that the speed of light is always the same, always constant, never changes. It's the one absolute that Einstein used to make his theory. As much as he talked about relativity, the fact is Einstein needed an absolute to make everything else relative. It's the way you can look at it. Okay, you need something solid in order to put other information on and interpret that information. If you don't have something solid, something absolute, you're in no man's land. Okay, and that's why geocentrism is so good, because it gives man an absolute from which he can measure everything else in the universe. Everything. Once he has an absolute, once he knows the earth isn't moving, he has an absolute. You see? So, but if you have a moving earth, you don't have an absolute. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to search for an absolute. And so Einstein made light speed his absolute. And then everything else in the universe is measured off of the speed of light, because that's the only absolute they have. We even measure distance to the stars in what? Light years or light seconds. Why? Because that's our absolute. Thank you, Uncle Albert. Okay. But now we're finding out in the GPS that it's not an absolute. It goes slower one way than in another way. Okay. So what do they have to do? And we knew this again in 1913 when Dominique, it was a Dominique uh, Sagnac, is his last name, Sagnac, in 1913, did an experiment. And he showed that light speed going one way goes slower than light speed going another way. Okay. And that was verified again in 1925 with Albert Michelson, who did another experiment, and he found the same thing. Okay. So we knew this experimentally before the GPS were ever invented. But now that you have invented the GPS and you think that electromagnetic beam that you send from the east is going to be the same speed as the electromagnetic beam you send from the west, that's what you think, because you've been told that over and over again by people who believe in special relativity. And then you find out that that's not true. Then what do? Well, then you have to program the computers to take into account the discrepancy. And that's what Ron Hatch found. He found that the GPS computers were adjusted to account for the slower speed of light west to east as opposed to east to west. Now, that tells you a little bit about what's going on in science today. Because the supreme goal is to protect Albert Einstein. Okay. And I could go into all the reasons why that's true, but I'm not. But that's what the goal is. And so what you do is you adjust the computers to take into account the slower speed of light. And now your computer works as if the light speed is the same, east-west or west-east. And you tell the public, see, special relativity is proven because the light speed goes the same speed. The light beam goes the same speed either way. Okay? But they don't tell you that they adjusted the computers to do that. See, now Ron was privy to the GPS by contract. You couldn't say to Ron, I'm sorry, we can't allow you to go in there. Hey, there's a lot of money at stake because if you can get these tractors to go straight down the field, there's a lot of money to be made. Okay? John Deere tractor, it's probably, I think their stock's at like 400 or something, and it's been there and it just continues to rise because this company makes a lot of money. And one of the good things is they have GPS controlling their tractors. And so if their contractee can't get into the GPS, that's going to be a big problem. Okay, so he had the right to go in there, found out what the discrepancy was, and found out what they were doing to fix it, and put that in his papers. Here's what's going on, folks. They basically lied to you about the speed of light being constant. And in order to cover this up, they adjust the computers, but they don't tell you that they're adjusting the computers. Only people like Ron Hatch can go in there and find out. You're not going to find out. Okay. So it has a problem with special relativity. As for general relativity, it's very complicated. Okay. Because now you're dealing with gravitational forces from the Earth affecting the electromagnetic beam, and the fact that the beam, you have to figure out whether, because light beams always go straight, but yet you have a curved Earth. And when you have a curved Earth, you have a geodesic, and that's where general relativity comes in, dealing with geodesics of curved surfaces, and so it gets rather complicated. Okay. Now, Ron Hatch did a whole study on how the GPS relates to general relativity. He was convinced that general relativity does not help explain the problem. It just makes it more complicated. Okay. So I really can't get into that with you. All I can tell you is the simpler version, and that's the issue with the special relativity. Okay. So general relativity is different because you're dealing with gravity and geodesic surfaces. So it's not going to make it as easy to explain. I think I've read Ron's paper 5 times, and I still have problems understanding it. But he was convinced that general relativity did not help the GPS problem. Okay, that's as far as I go. If you want to go any further into it, I suggest you go on the internet, find Ron Hatch's papers about this issue. Just put Ron Hatch and GPS, and it'll take you right to him. Okay? All right. Would existence of black holes prove that time is not absolute because of how they are supposed to work? All right. So, no. Time is absolute because time is a metaphysical notion that in order to go from moment to moment, there has to be an interval. Okay, we know that. Because when I just said we know that, that happened 2 seconds ago. Or you could say 2,000 microseconds ago. Whatever component label you want to put on it. The fact is that I said so that now 10 seconds ago. Okay. So that's what we call moments. Here's a moment where something happens, or it may not, or something may not happen. Okay. Something may not change because sometimes they try to define time as change. Not necessarily true. It's definitely true that when something changes, it takes time to change. But the definition of time is not dependent on whether something changes. Something can not change and still have time. Okay? So you have to be very careful with your definition of time. And when these guys are the guys that you're pointing to and talking about black holes and all that, they have a different definition of time because their definition of time is how fast the clock runs. Okay? So if the clock runs slower, they're going to say, well, time has changed. No. Okay. I mean, I admit that that might be a first inclination you might have. But if you go deeper into it, you say not necessarily. Because there are many factors that will affect how fast a clock runs. Okay. If you have your watch on ground zero, right on the surface of the earth, it's going to run slower than if you bring that clock up to the top of Mount Everest, which is what, 29,000 feet above the surface of the earth. Why is that the case? Well, because the gravity, what they call the gravitational potential, is different at 29,000 feet above the surface of the earth than it is on the surface of the earth. It's stronger on the surface of the earth. The closer you are to the earth, the stronger is the gravitational field. Okay? And that's why you can send a rocket up, and if you send it up fast enough, it can escape the Earth's gravitational field. Because the further away you go, the less gravity there is. Okay? So we know that much. So gravity can affect the how fast a watch ticks. Okay? What else can affect it? Well, anything that's external to the watch that can affect the watch will affect how fast the watch ticks. Okay? I mean, it could be gravity, it could be inertial forces, it could be cosmic rays, it could be gamma rays, anything that's from the outside that can affect the electrons and or the atoms inside that watch. It's going to affect the time. It's going to affect how fast that watch ticks. And some people would interpret that as affecting time. And that's where they get this whole idea that the black hole, because its gravity is so intense, is going to slow down time. No. What it's going to do is slow down the timing mechanism. Okay. And it's going to tick slower, a lot slower, in a high gravitational field. Okay. But the metaphysical idea that you're going from moment to moment and there's an interval between that one moment to the next moment, that's what time is. And you can apply any label to that interval you want. You can call it a second, okay, or you can call it whatever you want. Doesn't make any difference what the label is. The only thing that counts is the fact that there's an interval there. And if there's an interval, we know there's time. That's what we call time. Just as an abstract notion, okay? So in that sense, time doesn't change. The only thing that changes from one place to another is the rate at which clocks tick. And that's dependent on a lot of factors, okay? All right. Dr. Sungenis, why did the Catholic Church change the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday? Well, first of all, you need to recognize that the Catholic Church had the power, had the authority to do that. Okay. That's usually missed in conversations on this topic. Why did they have the authority? Well, that's what happened when Jesus said to Peter, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven." Okay? That gave the church the power, the authority to change the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. Okay? So it's not just willy-nilly that the church sort of said, "Hey, I don't like Saturday. Let's move it over to Sunday." No. If you're going to change something that serious, you better have the authority to do so. Okay. And you also need a good reason, of course. Okay. And the reason was because we're done with the Old Testament. We're done with the Mosaic Law. Okay. We don't live by the Mosaic Law any longer. And the fact is that the Sabbath became inextricably intertwined with the Mosaic Law. Okay. So that it wasn't just the seventh-day Sabbath from the past, where God created the earth, the world in 7 days and rested on the seventh day. Okay. That was true in itself, but now the seventh-day Sabbath was made part of the Mosaic Law, part and parcel with the Mosaic Law. And then there were certain strictures about obeying the Sabbath in the Mosaic Law that had to be maintained. Otherwise, you would have been punished. For example, the Sabbath had to be from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. or 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Not 1 second longer, not 1 second shorter. Now, of course, they didn't have watches in those days, so they knew by about, they pretty much knew after doing it so long when 6 p.m. occurred. So, and then there were certain ways you had to worship on the Sabbath. And one of those ways was that you could do no servile work, to the point that a man who was caught picking up sticks on the Sabbath day was brought before the elders to determine what should they do with him. And they asked the Lord, and the Lord said, "You stoned him to death for picking up sticks." Okay? So that's what the Sabbath was back in the Mosaic Law. Okay? You couldn't walk more than 3/4 of a mile on the Sabbath day. If you did, you'd be subject to being stoned to death. Very strict. When the priest did his sacrifices, if he did it on the Sabbath day, you had to have certain animals, you had to have certain garments, you had to have certain vessels. It had to be done at a certain place. All kinds of extracurricular things were going on in order to obey the Sabbath day. So it wasn't just obeying the seventh day, although that was also strict, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. There were a lot of things that had to be done during that Sabbath day. Otherwise, the civil law of the civil component of the Mosaic law would make sure that you paid for it. Okay. So the church said, we're not going to live that way anymore. We live in freedom. That was the whole Christian message, is freedom from the law. The law is always in the back of our mind, okay? Because we need to know, can't steal, can't bear false witness, all that stuff. We know it's always there, okay? But we do that now as Christians out of love for God and our fellow man, not because the law says so. Now, the law says so, and it's holy and it's good. It reminds everybody, okay, here's your responsibility. But just don't do it because you want to obey the law. The law's nothing. People are something. Okay, so you want to obey the law because you love people, you love God. That's the whole Christian message. And in order to do that, you need freedom. Okay, if you're hampered by all these laws and you're thinking about, I got to do this, I got to do that, what time do you have to treat people the way they want to be treated? You're thinking about laws, and that's what the Pharisees ended up doing. All day long, they're thinking about laws, and they even added more laws because they were law lovers. They were not people lovers. They're not God lovers. They're law lovers. Because by the law, they could show people how great they were. Look at me. I obey the law here and there and everywhere. Okay? So the law can get in the way of being the person you should be. It can actually get in the way. And there's one point in Ezekiel where God says, you know what? I am so sick of their law loving. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give them even more laws. Laws that I know they can't do just because they're law lovers. And they can go futz around with their laws all they want because they're not going to, love me for who I am. They're going to love their laws. So I'm going to give them some more laws. And that's why he ended up with so many laws in the Pentateuch. Law for this, law for that, law for the other thing, because God just got fed up with their whole mentality and said, here, you want to be law lovers? Here's a couple dozen more for you. Go do these. Don't bother me because I know your heart's not in it. Okay. So that's what laws can do for you. So here's the thing. When you do away with the Sabbath law, you're doing away with all the baggage that comes with it. Okay, all the other civil and ceremonial laws that were attached to it, because they all come as one package. Okay, if you're going to obey the Sabbath law, then you're going to have to obey everything that was in the Old Testament about the Sabbath law, without exception. Is that what we want? No. Okay. Because Christianity is all about freedom. Not freedom to do whatever you want, but freedom to do the right thing. And not doing because some law's telling you to do it. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do, and it's coming from my heart. Okay? That's the real difference. And what's the best emblem we have for that? The Christ's resurrection from the dead. Because that put the seal on all of the Christian message. Because if Christ didn't rise from the dead, then everything we're doing, you can talk about the heart all you want. Living from the heart, not the law. It ain't going to amount to a hill of beans without the resurrection of Christ. Because we know that we're obeying God from the heart because we love him, but we in turn want God to keep us alive so that we can continue to live this way. And if Christ wasn't raised from the dead, every single one of us would die and never live again. So what good is living from the heart if you can't live and practice it continually forever? Okay? So, wow. So that's what the church said. We're going to use that emblem as the reason we worship God on a special day. And we're going to do it on Sunday because that's when he rose from the dead. Okay? So it's just the opposite of what the law was for in the Old Testament. Okay? So we got rid of the whole kit and caboodle and basically started from scratch. We basically started from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus said, you heard it was said, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm going to tell you this. This is the way you should live. From the heart. Okay? I don't care about how many laws you obey. If your heart's not right with me, who cares? Okay? So that's why we got rid of it. All right. What are your thoughts about the luminous mysteries? The luminous mysteries are good. I like them. I really do like them. Pope John Paul II picked out some good events that happened in the life of Jesus that are on the same level, as good as all the other events that were picked for the rosary. Okay. Now remember, these are all man-made. Okay. The rosary didn't drop out of heaven. Somebody sat down and said, okay, which of the events do we want to exemplify in a prayer called the rosary? And that's what we got. Somebody could add to that. Okay. We never expected, and all the traditionalists got all upset. Well, because we have 5 more, events in the rosary. Who cares? Okay, I mean, there's nothing to get upset about. These are events that happen in Scripture. We know that. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with praying alongside of them and being illuminated by them. Nothing. You could add 5 more events if you wanted to. Of course, then you run into the problem I've talked about before. Then you make the rosary too long. Okay? I mean, you could add 50 different events to the rosary if you wanted to. All right? But we don't, because there's a practicality to all this, and that is you don't want to make it too long. All right? Now, there may be some people out there who can get on their knees and pray the rosary, have no problem whatsoever. They got the time, But there's a lot of other people who don't. And your religion has to be practical as well as it is worshipful to God. And there has to be some balance there. Okay? So that's why we don't add 50 more events to the rosary. But as far as the luminous mysteries are concerned, there's nothing wrong with them at all. Okay? All right. Next question. Why was Jesus afraid to die? Because he was human. Built inside each one of us is the desire to survive. The desire to survive. I mean, think of yourself in a very desperate situation where you're in a car accident, or you're walking on the precipice of a mountain, or you're in an airplane that's suddenly shaking. Any kind of event where your life is now threatened. What are your instincts? Your instincts are survival, because it's built into you. Okay, that's what it is to be human. Not only human, but even animals have that. What is the basic instinct of all animals? To survive. Okay, it's built into them. You could say the similar thing happens when you recoil from some object that's causing you pain. Why do you recoil from it? Why do you try to get away from it? When you stick your hand in the fire, you pull your hand out. Why? Because it's painful. Okay? And you know that if you kept your hand in there, it'd burn, and then probably burn the rest of your body. And so there's where the survival instinct takes over. Okay? You pull your hand from the fire because you have the survival instinct. Okay? You drive safely in your car because you have a survival instinct. If you didn't, you could be going down the highway this way and somebody's coming the other way on a highway, and they just turn their wheel and smash right into you. Why don't they do that? You ever hear that? At least not on purpose. Because everybody has a survival instinct. Everybody. And it's built deep within us. It's just like the aging factor that we have. Where is it? I don't know. Nobody else knows either. If they did know, they'd probably try to fix it. But we have an aging factor that God put in us where we age. Okay? And we look totally different than we were when we were a teenager. Some resemblance, but we age. And then we're going to get old and decrepit and wrinkly and die. Okay? So that's built into us. There are certain things that God built into us as humans. And Jesus had every one of them. Every single one of them. Okay? If he didn't, he wouldn't be human. But that's what it is to be human. You fear death. Okay? So, all right. I'm sure you've been asked this before, but would Christ have come to earth if Adam hadn't fallen? I assume you're saying, would Christ become human and come to earth if Adam hadn't fallen? The answer would be no. Absolutely no. Okay? There'd be no reason for him. If Adam had obeyed, Eve had obeyed, well, you can even say even if Eve hadn't obeyed and Adam did, Adam's still the federal head, and everything's going to be based on his obedience, not Eve's, because he could have brought Eve to the court of justice and had her executed. Okay? He was the head. He was already given that headship from the time he was created first. And to save the human race, that's what he could have done. And we would have been in the image of Adam. Whatever the test would have been over, we all would have enjoyed God's blessing from the obedience of Adam. And whatever God wanted to do in the future for that, I don't know. But it would be everything good. Nothing would be evil. The devil would be judged because Adam had decided to go with God, and God would be the judge and destroy the devil so that even the devil wouldn't be here any longer. Okay, wow, that's pretty nice existence. Okay, and we would have been in the image of Adam. Whatever Adam was, that's what we would have been. Okay, now the curious thing is, because Adam sinned, then Christ, the Trinity, decided that the second person of the Trinity would come as a man to suffer for man and die for man and open up that passageway that Adam had blocked. And the benefit of that, if you want to call it the silver lining, so to speak, of Adam's sin, is that now we're going to be recreated in the image of Jesus Christ, not Adam. Okay? Now we'll have Adam's, like Adam was a human and we'll be human, but we're going to be made human in the image of the divine person and human person, Jesus Christ. Okay, so he had two natures, divine and human, in one person. We're going to be very similar to that. Whereas if Adam had obeyed, we wouldn't have had anything divine about us. Okay, and God can make that distinction between his divinity and the similarity of divinity that he's going to give us, combined with our human nature, to live for eternity in the new heaven and new earth. Now that is a deal I like. Okay? So it takes the sting out of Adam's fault, Adam's sin, because now God's going to restore us a millionfold, a billionfold better than what we would have been if Adam had obeyed and we retained his image alone. Okay? What a fantastic plan God had. It's not like God says, oh my gosh, Adam, what did you do? What am I going to do now? No. And only somebody as great as God could think that out and make it even better than it was before. Wow. Now, there's a price to pay for that. Okay? It's one thing to say, oh, wow, look at what we've got in store for us, better than it ever would have been. The price we pay for that is that there's going to be a lot of people that are not going to enjoy that. Okay? They're not going to enjoy that because they're going to end up in hell. Okay? They're going to end up in hell, and whatever God decides to do with them after that, that's his discretion, of course, but we're going to lose a lot, even though we gain a lot. And that's just the way life is. Okay? There were no guarantees to begin with. The only guarantee that we had was that whatever happened, God was going to work it out to be the best that it possibly could be. And that's what he did. And the best that it possibly could be is that, he can't allow people who don't love him, people that are evil, to be in that new state. It's just impossible. But that doesn't mean that those of us who do want it shouldn't have it because the others don't want it. They're not going to mess it up for everybody. And God is the one, of course, who can make the ultimate judgments in every angle, with every person, in every situation, and it's all going to be perfectly done. So we have nothing to worry about. Okay? All right. Let's move on. Have you read Kennedy Hall's new book about the defense of the SSPX? No, I haven't. I know Kennedy. I've debated him before on the Fatima issue. He's okay. I don't think he would be the best spokesman for that position. I don't think there's anybody that can be the best spokesman for that position, to be quite honest with you, because um, the people that I know, like John Salza, who have dealt with Kennedy Hall's book, say that there's nothing there that is going to change the story, change John's story. There are certain basic things that Kennedy or anybody else are not going to be able to get around. Okay, and that's the jurisdiction issue. And calling your own emergency, saying that overrides the jurisdiction issue. Well, that's a call you can't make. Okay, it's not for you to make. So not directly have I dealt with Kennedy's book, but indirectly through the guy that I think is the authority on this, and that's John Salza. And I trust John. I haven't found a flaw in this argument. And I've known John for probably, 20 years or so. And he did a good job. So now I understand the problem is, the present Pope and his curia, and what he just elected one of his Argentinian fellows, very liberal, to take over the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. And I just see problems coming from that left and right down the road. And they're upset. They're upset about it, and they should be. Okay? They have the right to be upset. I don't take that away from them at all. But the thing about being a Catholic Christian is you can be upset, but don't overreact. Don't overreact and get yourself in more hot water than you would have been in the first place. Okay? You can't overreact in the way, Martin Luther overreacted. Yeah, Tetzel was selling indulgences to build St. Peter's Cathedral. That's a fact. Okay? But he overreacted. He threw the baby out with the bathwater. And now look at us. We got 40,000 plus Protestant denominations, and more built every week. Okay? And so that's one lesson we need to learn. You don't overreact. You suffer. You suffer. Most of Catholicism is built on suffering. Why? Because you can't change the evil. You can try. You can pray. You can hope somebody comes along that fixes it, but 9 times out of 10, it ain't going to happen. Okay? So we have to suffer with the evil. And we do as much as we humanly can. I'm not against, sitting on my duff and just hoping that God fixes it. No, we don't do that either. We do as much as we can, but sometimes we do as much as we can, and we can't fix it. It is what it is. And we have to live with that. We have to suffer. And if you don't realize that as a Catholic, you better. Because you might react yourself right out of the Catholic Church. And essentially, that's what they've done. When you're in schism, you've just about crossed that line where you're out of the church. The next stop is sedevacantism. Okay? That's the real overreaction. Okay? Because, people have this thing about you. I want to fix, and I want to fix today. Yeah, I do too. But it ain't going to happen. Okay? Jesus gave us the example. He said, look, fellas, you think you got power over me? I could call down 12 legions of angels right now, and my Father would send them in a split second. And you would be vanquished. Never heard from again. Okay? He could have done that. Okay? But he chose to suffer and die. Let evil have its way, because it's only going to go so far. And God will work it out. And we suffer along and we remain a Catholic. Okay? That's what it's all about. The New Testament tells us over and over and over again, endure to the end. Don't give up the ship. And why would it tell us that? Because it knows we're going to run into situations where we want to give up the ship. Okay? Well, we can't, because we'll lose our salvation. We'll cut off our nose to spite our face. Can't have that. That's exactly what the devil wants us to do. Overreact and start breaking up the church and putting your own salvation at risk. No. Look, we're way ahead of him. Okay? All that learning that you've learned, you're way ahead of the devil. Okay? So don't waste it. All right, let's go on to the next question. Dr. Sungenis, how is your Catholic Commentary, Volume 2, Luke Acts, coming along? When should we suspect? Suspect? You mean expect, right? Expect it to be available. I am halfway done the book of Acts. It's taken a long time for some reason. So I'm being very tedious about it. It's the last book, and I want to make sure I do a great job. So it's coming, but some things get in the way, and that's probably my biggest problem. Something will get in the way. And the thing that's getting in the way right now is another book that I am just about to publish on the Jewish covenant. As it relates to the teaching of the Catholic Catechism, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, and the USCCB, the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, and what they have said about it. And they're all problematic. And that's taken up a lot of time. It's about 250 pages. And I should have that ready to go within a couple of weeks, but that's taken up a lot of time, and I can't get to the Bible as much as I wanted to. But I'm still working on it, and you can suspect that I will have that completed by the end of the year. And then the whole thing will be done, thank God. All 27 books of the New Testament. I had an interesting email today from someone, sent me one of my dear patrons from many years ago sent me an email and said, "You left out one page of your commentary in the Apocalypse." And I went to look, and he was right. I don't know how it happened, but he was right. So I had to spend today putting that page back in. And fortunately, I had another copy. So I put that into the final version, and I have to upload that to the bookstore and all that. So I was working on that all morning. Anyway, but I'm glad he told me, and I was able to fix it. So let me go on. Cello Gonzalez says, God bless. God bless you too, Cello. Any thoughts on the Bishop Strickland apostolic visit and what the issue may be? Well, Robert, I think we know what the issue is without even being told. Bishop Strickland is a little too loud for the Vatican today, a little too outspoken. When you go to Los Angeles and call out the Dodgers for having, LBGTQXYZ promotion, hey, That's the kind of bishop we need. But that's not kosher with the Vatican. We don't do that as bishop. So that's what it's all about. They're going to give him an ultimatum. You either sit in your chair like all the other bishops and just give, little dainties of morality every once in a while in a letter. But don't go out there into the streets and start, wearing a sackcloth and ashes and, all this stuff. Okay, see, they don't like that. That's what they should be doing, but they don't like that. So that's what he's going to be told. You either settle down and stop getting so excited about the faith, or we're going to put the clamps on you. And we'll move you to, somewhere in Wyoming, okay, or Montana, and you can preach to the cattle. Okay, so Tyler, Texas, you like Tyler? Okay, well then listen to what we're telling you, or you're going to have, something that's 1/10 of the size of Tyler, and it's your choice. Okay, so we'll see what he does. All right. Does Christ know the final day now that he's in heaven with the Father? I would say he does, yes. Because that's what he prayed for in his high priestly prayer in John 17. If you remember that prayer at all, he says, Father, allow it to be as it was when I was with you before the world was created. There's a lot in that statement, a lot in that prayer. What Jesus is asking the Father, and we would think, does he really have to ask for that? Well, yeah, because they're all in this together and they all share their thoughts. And as Jesus says, I do nothing except the Father tells me. Okay, so that's how intimate they are. He prays for this, and he says, he's basically saying, I want my human nature to share in its totality with my divine nature. Because that's how it was when Jesus was with the Father before the world was created. There was no limitations. Okay. But now that he's human and he's praying and he's just about to go to the cross, there are limitations on the power that he has, on the knowledge that he has. And that's because he voluntarily gave them up. That's what Philippians chapter 2 tells us. He voluntarily gave them up, gave up his divine power. Not that he wasn't divine anymore, but gave up the use of his divine power so that his human nature would be dealing with earth, men, the cross, everything. Okay? And that's why he feared death. We talked about that earlier. Because it's his human nature in the Garden of Gethsemane that's dealing with all this stuff. Okay? And that's why he's weak. That's why he's wondering, do I have to go through this? Okay? But now he's praying in John 17 that no longer should that be the case. No longer will it have to be the case where I put my divine nature on the shelf, as it were, not separate, but not helping my human nature. And I want them both to work together in the ultimate sense with no restrictions, no limitations. And that prayer was granted. Okay. So now when Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God, His full human nature and his full divine nature are working together perfectly and ultimately. No restrictions. So that means his human nature can do things that we never even thought possible. Like coming back on the clouds of glory, second coming, all that kind of stuff. Appearing in the Eucharist all over the world at the same time. Yeah, that kind of stuff. Um, making Eucharistic miracles. This human nature has no limitations now. Okay. So, wow. Wow. What a Jesus we're going to see in heaven. A totally human, yet totally divine in one person, manifesting his works everywhere in the new heaven and the new earth. What a fantastic thing that's going to be. All right. What are the geocentric and heliocentric explanations for why a sidereal day? I already explained that, so we don't have to go through that. Did Pope Francis teach error when he changed CCC 2267? Is it now permissible for a nation to implement the death penalty because it's contrary to the gospel? Okay, so no, he did not commit an error. Now, that's not to say, however, that there aren't errors in the Catholic Catechism. Okay. There are a lot of errors in the Catholic Catechism. I'm not going to go through them now, but this is not one of them. Okay. The Pope has the right to alter this thing about the death penalty because of changing circumstances in the world. One of them is DNA evidence. Okay. There have now been almost 270, I think it's 265 or 66 people that have been exonerated from death row because DNA found that they were not guilty. Okay. Now, really, the number doesn't really make a difference. It just helps you solidify the case more. It could be 3 people have been found innocent when they were convicted in a court of law of committing murder, and they resulted in them being on death row. 3. It could have been 6. It could have been 9. It doesn't make any difference. The principle is the same. Since we have the capability to determine whether the court was right or wrong once that DNA evidence surfaces after the court case, if that's the principle we're working with, then we better adjust our understanding of the death penalty. He has that right. Okay. Before, we had to depend on the court, the fallible court of 12 peers determining whether we live or die, of people who don't even know the law. So this English system of the jury, wherein, okay, it's your peers, all right, that makes it fair because it's your peers, but whether they know about the law and can figure out the law and apply it to a situation, that's another question. Okay. But that's this jury system, that's this legal system we have. And it's probably one of the best that are out there. Okay. Especially when it says you're innocent until proven guilty, as opposed to, say, someplace like Italy where you're guilty until proven innocent. A lot of countries that deal with criminals that way, or potential criminals. But still, it's not a perfect system. Not a perfect system. And that's been proven 265 times. Okay. So, as I said, the number makes no difference. It could be 265, 5, or 2065. the principle is there, okay, that we can relook at this whole thing. And there's other reasons why we would want to relook it, but I'm not going to get into those right now. I'm just going to give you the short version and tell you that because of that, no, it's not an error in the catechism. Is the universe actually expanding? If not, why do scientists think it is? Deborah. See, I'm just, exasperated because it just takes so long to get to the final answer. Let me try to think of a short version. Okay, so you're a scientist. You're trying to figure out where's the universe come from. So one of your scientists named Hubble looks through his telescope and he sees that all the galaxies have what they call a redshift. The light that's coming from the galaxy is put in a spectrometer, and the spectrometer will break up the white light into all different kinds of colors, and each color tells you something. If you see a lot of red, that means something's happening. And your first inkling would be to say, okay, where's all this red coming from? Everywhere I look, it's coming. I don't see any blue shifts, green shifts, yellow shifts. All I see is red shifts. Every time I break this light up and look at it in the spectrometer, it's going to show me red shift everywhere I look in the universe. Now, what that means, and Hubble knew this right away, he writes it in his book, 1937 book, The Observational Approach to Cosmology. That means the Earth is in the center of the universe. Oh my God. No, it can't be. Copernicus was wrong. Galileo's wrong. Kepler's wrong. Newton's wrong. The Earth is in the center of the universe. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Well, I know this. We can't have that. We can't admit that 500 years of science has been wrong and the Pope was right. Can't do that. What will that do to science? My God. Think about it. Okay? So, what do? Well, let's dream up a different scenario why we see this redshift in all these galaxies. I know. We'll say that the galaxies are moving away from us. The universe is expanding. And when it expands, it stretches the white light so that when that white light gets to Earth, we see red, more red than any other color because the light's been stretched, because the universe is expanding. We got it! Perfect explanation. Fits like a glove. That's what we'll do. And that's what they did. But here's the caveat. They had to do away with Euclidean three-dimensional geometry and create a universe that was just two-dimensional. In other words, it was like a balloon. You know what a balloon is. You blow it up, and all you see is a surface. It has no center, because we're not going to call the air inside the balloon the center, because that's not plastic. Okay? All that balloon has is a surface. And so here's what we'll do. We'll put all the galaxies on the surface of that balloon. Okay? Nothing in the middle. We got rid of the center because we don't want the Earth to be in the center. That's the motivation for all this. Okay? And then what we'll do is we'll blow the balloon. And it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And what's it going to do? Well, it's going to spread all those galaxies out from one another. And so when they look at one another, they're all going to see redshift, which is what I see in my telescope today, redshift. So there you go. put them all in a balloon, blow it up, say the universe is expanding. That's why we see redshift, and the rest is history. Okay? So, that's why we got it today. All to get away from the first observation he made, which was that the Earth was in the center of the universe. Okay? So, now you know the true story. Okay? They're not going to tell you this. No way. They're hoping that guys like me either go away, shut up, or die, or whatever. But as long as I have a breath, I'll tell you. And so that's where the expanding universe came from. Okay. And what else can I tell you to wrap it up? That's it. So the geocentric universe, the true universe, is not expanding, of course. Okay. It's all one big sphere. It is moving, however, but it's rotating around the fixed Earth. That's the very thing Hubble saw. He saw the Earth in the center, which means it's fixed. And he saw the galaxies going around it. Okay. That's the geocentric universe, but he didn't want that. Okay. So there you go. All right. Question: what led you to rejoin the Catholic Church after 17 years as a Protestant? Was it singular event or a combination of things? Everything's usually a combination of things. I was having the last church that I was in the Protestant world. Well, no, that really didn't have anything to do with it. What happened was some Protestant friends I used to work with at a radio station in California had become Catholic. And I heard about it through the grapevine, and I wasn't going to touch it with a 10-foot pole because at that point in my life, I didn't want to hear anything about Catholicism. I just thought that Catholicism was so out to lunch, so wrapped up in its own rituals, didn't know the Bible, just gave it lip service, had all these saints that they, worshipped, and Mary included, the whole 9 yards. I was like St. Paul, with Christianity. I hated it, at least Catholic Christianity. I loved Protestant Christianity, even though they were all confused. It was just a continual search for who had the best interpretation of Scripture. That's what kept you going. Somebody out there has to have it. Okay. And even if they don't have it perfectly, at least they have it better than everybody else. And that's the search you were on as a Protestant. So that kept you going. That's the verve. That's the motivation. But these two friends of mine became Catholic, and I had no idea why they became Catholic. I didn't want to know, blah, blah, blah. One day they got enough nerve to come over and knock on my door. They knew where I lived. Oh, no. I remember what happened. One of the guys called me up, and he was trying to reach his friend, the other guy that I was telling you about. His name was Bob. And, my name's Bob, Robert Bob. So he tries to call this guy Bob, and he looks at the wrong number in his address book. And my name just happened to be right below this other Bob's name. So he's calling me, Jerry is calling me Bob, and he thinks he's got the other Bob. So I answered the phone. Hi, Jerry. How are you? And I knew Jerry had become Catholic. And I said, what can I do for you? because I was just going to politely say, hi, how you doing? And then hang up the phone because I knew the next thing that was going to come out of his mouth was, I converted to Catholicism. Jerry was just that kind of guy, just, exuberant, nothing held him back. Innocent kind of guy, and he was going to tell you whether you wanted to hear it or not. So I something in me, I just said, I need, this guy's my friend. I need to be more polite to him. So I said, hey, Jerry, tell me what's going on in your life. That was the last thing I should have said. But I did. And an hour and a half later, Jerry's telling me all about his conversion to Catholicism. Here I was going to politely hang up the phone within about 3 minutes. And I'm talking to him for an hour and a half. And he's going on and on and on. And I'm just going, yeah. And then he got to the communion of saints. He's telling me about the communion of saints. And I'm listening and I'm listening. All of a sudden, I began to feel differently. Like it started to make sense to me. Okay, yeah. Where all those dead people go? They're in heaven. Okay. Makes sense. And I said, Jerry, I just feel very strange. I don't know why, but something had just come over me. And I said, I think it has to do with your thing about the communion of saints. And he goes, why? He goes, well, it's strange, but I just feel, because I was in my living room. This was in Oakland, California. I just feel like all these saints are hovering around my living room against the wall, and their heads are not hitting the ceiling, they're just a little lower than the ceiling. And they're all around and they're praying. They're praying. And the next thing out of Jerry's mouth was, well, that's what I told you. It's the communion of saints. Oh, okay. Well, that explains it. But I mean, he didn't skip a beat. He just took the cue that I gave him. There's all these disembodied souls, whatever they were, in my living room praying. I didn't see anything. I just felt it. I just felt somebody was in the room. A lot of them. And he goes, yeah, that's the communion of saints. I go, oh, yeah, okay. Just that question. Next. But I said, Jerry, I actually feel very strange right now, and I don't know why. Something's come over me, and I need to go. So he goes, okay, no problem. After an hour and a half, and we hung up the phone. And of course, I am in a little stupor now. I'm just, I don't know exactly what to think, because I'm normally not a guy who goes by feelings first. And yet here it was. I felt something. And it wasn't an emotion. It was just like a feeling of, wow, somebody was here. And maybe that's why I feel different. I don't know. Anyway, so a couple days go by, and Jerry, the guy who called me, finally gets a hold of the Bob he wanted to get a hold of in the first place, who had also converted to Catholicism. And Jerry's, of course, telling Bob, hey, I just met Bob Sungenis and had a conversation with him for an hour and a half about Catholicism. And he said he's feeling pretty strange right now and just needed time to think and blah, blah, blah. And so Jerry and Bob figure out, okay, here's our chance. So they get all these Catholic books together, put them in a box. And one of them was the little red book, I remember that, The Church of Our Fathers, written by Cardinal Gibbons. Never read it before. Well, that was in the box, and it was coming to my house. So Jerry and Bob come over in the afternoon 2 days later and knock on my door and say, "Hi, Bob, how you doing?" And it's like, "I'm doing good. How are you?" Because I knew why they were there. They were going to convert me to Catholicism. And I said, "Hey, no problem. We know you're busy right now. We just brought over a bunch of books for you to read because you showed some interest in them. So we figured, what the heck? Well, you might as well follow up on that." I said, "Okay, do this. Just leave the books outside the door here. Now, just put them inside the door. Put them inside the door, and I'll go through them if I want. If not, I'm going to call you up and tell you to come pick them up again." Okay? So they were very polite, put the books down inside my door, and left, and I didn't hear from them. And so for the next day or so, I'm walking by the front door and I'm looking, what's in there, And I didn't want to look too closely because I knew it would be something that, I probably might not want to read. Because I still had my druthers against Catholicism. I just didn't want to go that direction. And there I saw this little red book in there, and it was just laying on the top, and I said, just let me, how this thing looks harmless, how could you explain the whole faith in a little book that size? And that was the one that was written by Cardinal Gibbons, the Church of Our Fathers. And I just opened it up and read the content page, and for some reason I just started to read it. And after 3 days of reading it, I went from cover to cover, couldn't put it down. I wanted to be a Catholic again. Because for the first time in my life, someone had explained the faith to me so that I could understand it. So that it wasn't just all ritual and everything else the church believed in. Now it all made sense because someone put it all together for me. So that's how I became Catholic again. And that was 17 years as a Protestant. And I called the guys up at the Protestant church, said, "Guys, sorry." They were grooming me to be a leader in the church too, and put a lot of work into me. And I said, "Sorry, I've got other plans, and I'm going to become Catholic." And of course, they didn't want to hear about that at all. And so we split ways right away, and that's all there was to it. And that was in 1992. So here we are. Okay, so there you have my story. And unfortunately, it is 5 o'clock, so I have to go. I'm not able to answer all the rest of the questions here. So come back next week. That will be July 12th at 3 p.m. And we'll talk to you then. God bless you all. And please, if you can help at all, still in need, and I think a little bit more will help, and then I won't have to beg anymore. But if you can help, please stop at robertsongenis.org, give a little donation, and pray for me also that I can continue this every week. I do it for you, and I love to do it, and I hope I can continue to do it. And until, like I said, I don't have a breath to breathe. So that's my game plan. So help me to achieve it. Okay. God bless you all. See you next